Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Today is day 5 of teaser season for patch 3.22 and the Trials of the Ancestors expansion. It is the big one. Today is the patch notes. That is why this video is so long. And even though this video is long, it is the condensed version of a much longer live stream that I did earlier. If you want the whole long version that doesn't skip over a few of the details, then I'm going to put a link to that down in the description below. And also it'll show up on the last 20 seconds of this video as a little card you can click. Now, in terms of the things that are the biggest single takeaways in this, the biggest changes to game balance in this league are the removal of Vengeant Cascade. It is being replaced by something else, but it's basically gone. And there is going to be the removal of Legion 5-ways. They're not actually going away, but they're being nerfed in a way that I think is pretty much a killer for people who have been abusing them to get to level 100. This is actually going to have major implications on how well players can determine the best builds of the league, because it's no longer going to be possible for really bad builds to get up to level 100 easily by being carried by other players. It's not going to be impossible for that to happen, but it's going to dramatically reduce it. And so even though this is going to reduce a lot of players who are currently level 100, they're going to only be able to get to level 98 or 97 or 96 in future leagues. They're also going to have much more accurate information on what the best builds are. And so I'm not actually sure how that's going to wash out. There's still a bunch of other content that is XP as an item, so things like Chayula Breachstones, even to a lesser extent the other Breachstones, Syndicate Safe Houses, and Untainted Paradises for things that are harder to trade. All these sorts of things will still exist, but they're not on par or not even close to on par with the hyper-optimized way that Legion 5-ways have been used for leveling. Anyways, more on that later. Let's go through all of the information in today's patch notes. Firstly, I want to address a couple of hot button issues that have been coming up online in discussion around this. Firstly, the question of build diversity in this league. Build diversity in 321 was the highest it's ever been, and that is the reason that there's not sweeping changes in 322 in balance. There are no sweeping nerfs except for the basic removal of Vengeant Cascade. Vengeant Cascade will continue to exist, but it will be a new node, and it's something that will not go on the same builds, that's a lot weaker than the old one was. That's going to be something that's going to have a bit of an impact on past builds, but pretty much everything else survives the patch notes intact. There's also not really many sweeping changes to existing skills that were not doing all that well. What there is a number of things that are being added in the form of new support gems. These new support gems don't necessarily fit into existing builds, but many of them are things that new builds can pop up around. Some of these builds might be good, some of them might not be. We'll get to those support gems in a second. The ones that I think there's the most support for, though, are some of the things that relate to attacks that ignite. There is a lot of support in this patch for attack ignite builds, and whether that ends up being a successful setup or if it ends up just not having enough going for it, there is definitely a chance to explore new builds there. Basically, all the builds that worked in 321 will continue to work. Lightning Arrow will be meaningfully nerfed, probably down to the level of Ice Shot. Ice Shot will probably be nerfed to the point that it falls mostly out of the meta. It'll still be there, but it's not going to be anywhere near as good. Lightning Arrow will be the premier bow attack skill, but there's going to be a few new things as well. The other hot button topic that a lot of people have been talking about is that something like 35-40% of these patch notes are dedicated to Ruthless specifically. There's a lot of people whose initial reaction is, well, if 35% of the patch notes are about it, then 35% of the development time went into it, and that's just clearly not true. What's happened is that Ruthless has had one major feature change, and that is that the Eternal Labyrinth now grants Ascendancy points, and as a result, a lot of the Ascendancy notables have been nerfed, so that the intention is that Ruthless characters are weaker than core game characters. Almost all of these changes are just a database entry at GGG's end, and then they all end up generating a whole bunch of extra lines in the patch notes. The reason I think GGG have hard modes, and here I'm counting Ruthless, I'm counting Solo Self-Found, I'm counting Hardcore, is that they know very well that for a lot of unique items in PathOfExile, it's only really the first 1,000 or 2,000 of them that drop league-wide that are really seriously exciting loot. So if you get the 30th Impulse's Broken Heart that drops in the league, you can then turn around and sell it for a lot because it's a really exciting drop and almost no one else has it. But if you get the 17,224th Impulses that drops, it's not very exciting at all. Even though it's a really rare item, you're probably not going to see one until you've run another 3,000 or 4,000 maps at least, maybe as many as 10,000 or 20,000 maps if you're not juicing maps much. It's still not a very exciting item because the trade league is flooded with them. So the idea of hard modes is that they appeal to the most efficient players, broadly speaking, and they try to get those players out of interacting with the rest of the league economy. This means that more of the players that aren't that upper echelon of players get the chance to be the one that gets one of the really exciting early impulses, rather than all of them going to the old hands, because those old hands are playing in a hard mode instead. The problem with Ruthless is that PathOfExile's killer feature is how different the play experience of one map to the next is. In one map, you might have a Blight encounter spawn, a Betrayal encounter spawn, and a Breach encounter spawn, and you might be running a map tile set where you're chasing that Apothecary that probably won't drop. Your next map, you might be over in a map that has a Divine Orb Divination card like Cemetery, and that instead of having those League mechanics, it has a Legion instead, and also a High Smuggler's Cache. There's a huge bunch of things that are different from map to map, and on top of that you have map mods that are different from one to the other. This variance is the killer feature of PathOfExile. Ruthless doesn't have that variance, and so it hasn't captured the attention of even a large minority of the player base. That's the reason it's never really taken off. Honestly, I personally like Ruthless levels 1 to 75 and don't like it after 75, but I think that's the design intention and the flaw of Ruthless at the moment. It is designed to remove 1%ers from the Trade League economy so that they will have less of an impact, less of a dominance of that Trade League economy, but it's not really doing so. Solo Self-Found simply is achieving that goal better, even though I personally prefer Ruthless. That's the reason though that I think GGG are trying to get it into a better state than it was when it first launched, because if they can make it into the next Solo Self-Found, it's not going to appeal to everyone. There's going to be people that don't like it, but the effect of removing more of those top 1% players over to a hard mode is going to be an improvement for a large section of the player base, including people that never touch Ruthless. Anyways, that's enough on Ruthless. If you're not interested in the game mode, then there's a couple of sections of the patch notes you can just completely ignore, but it's also a bit unclear where the Ruthless section stops. Okay, so let's talk about the things that are really significant. The new content and features section of the patch notes has the most information here. This is the things that are going to have the biggest impact on your gameplay. Firstly, there's the Forbidden Sanctum going core, and there's a bit more on that later. Basically, Forbidden Sanctum monsters are getting buffed considerably, a couple of cheese strategies are getting addressed, and most notably, the radius at which monsters become invulnerable is 100 in the Forbidden Sanctum. It's 120 in the rest of the game. So what this means is that you can't really off-screen as much in the Forbidden Sanctum as you can in the rest of the game. There's a number of changes though, and if you're looking to get into the Forbidden Sanctum content, you're definitely going to want to read those in detail. Additionally, I'll have to do another video separately about the Sanctum uniques, because those are juicy. I'm not going to cover all of the support gems, just the ones that I've got a bit more to say about. Control Blaze is the first one. This is a support gem for melee attack Ignite builds, and it actually rewards attacking rapidly, which is something that Ignite generally doesn't want to do. The numbers on this are going to be everything, but it does seem like it's an interesting setup where the more rapidly you're attacking, the more of a boost to your Ignite damage you're getting, but we'll need to see exactly where the numbers line up on it. I think there may be some potential to play Control Blaze in conjunction with a Heat Shiver Frostblades character. There's definitely a lot of synergies there, especially if you're playing it on an Elementalist, although of course if you're playing this on an Elementalist you are going to be very, very squishy. Volatility is next. Volatility is one of those pure numbers gems, but it does something interesting that means that it's going to be interesting to different builds. So firstly, Volatility supports attack skills. It increases their maximum attack damage but decreases their minimum attack damage. Now this might seem like it's something that's the same whatever element you're trying to do. You know, maybe you're doing attacks with a chaos damage skill, maybe you're doing attacks with a cold damage skill. Should all be the same, right? That's actually not going to be the case. Most sources of increased lightning damage in the game, including those found on most skills that deal lightning damage, have a high maximum, which plays into the strengths of this skill, and a low minimum damage, which then also plays into the weaknesses of this skill. So Volatility support is really good in conjunction with the skills that deal lightning damage. It's also really good in conjunction with Bleed, where you can attack a monster multiple times and try and fish for that single biggest bleed on the enemy, or if you're playing with Crimson Dance, try and fish for 8 of them. Bleed's in a pretty bad state, and I don't think that this is going to be enough to get it over the line. But I do think that if you're someone who likes to play with skills that deal lightning damage, and they have to be attack skills for this to work, then this could be quite good. It also seems tailor-made for the unique claw Essentia Sanguis, but I don't think that's quite strong enough. Despite it being an extremely rare item, I don't think it's quite good enough for players to really want to use it. Flamewood is next, and this is just a really interesting support gem that does something pretty much unprecedented. It modifies your totems by giving them a retaliatory mortar strike that they can fire. I don't think this is going to work on most builds, but I am definitely watching this to use in conjunction with Searing Bond. It's all going to come down to the numbers and to the scaling. Guardian's Blessing has some drawbacks, but it allows one of your minions to carry an aura for you. It is a replacement for various other blessing skills. We already knew about returning projectiles, and Vengeant Cascade's nerf is that it is going to be changed entirely so that returning projectiles have plus 150% projectile speed. i.e. it's not going to be a chase anoint anymore. It might still be used by spectral throw characters. It will certainly be interesting there. So returning projectiles will have the same mechanics, but without all of the extra power that went in with them. And this is going to be the single biggest shakeup in terms of the meta from 3.21. Locust Mine is something that was teased already. This is a support gem that is somewhat different to Blast Chain Mine support and High Impact Mine support when used in conjunction to bows or wands, because this is something that hits a different area of the screen. I think that this is going to be something that tankier bow miners or tankier wand miners might run up to a boss and drop Locust Mines, then fire them all off. But ultimately it's going to depend on whether a bow attack mine or wand attack mine build can actually function well in this post 3.16 world, where both defensive auras and offensive auras are so strong, and where mines reserve mana as well. There's also Frigid Bond, Fresh Meat, Spellblade, and Devour, which have already been discussed. And there's Sacrifice, which was mentioned briefly during the 3.22 keynote at ExileCon. And this is going to be something that has incredibly strong synergy with Dissolution of the Flesh. Dissolution of the Flesh is one of the uniques that was added in 3.17. It's not something that fits every build, but it modifies the way your life pool works in a way that your current life actually doesn't matter anymore. Your current life isn't an important stat in terms of whether you stay alive or not. Instead, it's the amount that you've got unreserved at any given time. Sacrifice will then play around with the way that sacrificing life points is then no longer going to have a detrimental effect on your survivability, but you'll have more of them to sacrifice. So this is an interesting interaction that might end up making something useful. We'll have to find out when we get the hard numbers on it. This gem is very dependent on what those numbers are. Next is the number of Atlas Keystones. This is the transformation of Endgame, and I think in a lot of ways this is 25% of what used to be termed a large Atlas expansion. It's certainly not the scope of a full large Atlas expansion, but there's going to be a lot of significant things here that will change up the way you play the game. Extreme Archaeology is for experienced players who really know what they're doing and have a lot of experience with Expedition and just want to do their Expedition encounters faster. It's going to be really, really good in that narrow niche, but it's also going to brick some of your Expeditions, and there are going to be a lot of rips to this because players are just going to overestimate their ability to deal with a whole bunch of powerful mods that the monsters have on them. Lucid Dreams is next. I want to test this out. I think it's bad, but I'm willing to test it out and find out. We'll know more on this once the data mined information on the Vaal side area mods comes out, which is likely to be about 18 hours before leagues start. All Hands is something that's new. This is going to transform the way master missions work. You can no longer save them up by finishing maps. Instead, you'll get more of them, but you'll have to use them now. I actually don't like this Keystone, but I do see that there will be people who will have a bit of fun with it. If what you want to get out of your master missions is just a little bit of burst of something different to do in each map, this is going to increase the amount of variety from map to map, and so in that sense it's positive. However, if you want to strategically use your master missions, this runs completely at cross purposes to that, because you're not going to be able to set up your Atlas for Alva, run all your Alva missions, and while you're doing that, start accumulating some Jun missions, then set up your Atlas for Jun, and run all your Jun missions and accumulate some Nico missions while you're doing that. You're going to lose that agency with All Hands. In exchange for that agency, you'll get a bit more access to masters just with no control over when you get them. Is that worth it? You can make up your own mind on that. My answer is no. There's a bunch of really cool stuff about Torment in this expansion. Torment has been a terrible mechanic for a long time, but that doesn't mean that it is irredeemably terrible, and I think they've made some changes here that might make it play a bit better than it's been in the past. I'm actually quite keen to play around with the Torment stuff and make up my mind once I've done 100 maps that have got Torment content involved in them, because there's some cool stuff in there. Next, there is a Beyond passive that is very niche. This brings back some of the feel of Old Beyond, but I don't think it's going to appease people who want Old Beyond back, and I don't think it's going to be a good choice for most people. This is only for the very densest of maps. I would only consider this if you're running a Grand Design Atlas and if you're really cramming a lot of extra monsters on as well. But what it does is it stops Beyond events from finishing with a unique boss. Because when you have a Beyond event in a map, they finish when a unique boss spawns. That's the end of them. Instead, you're just not going to get that unique boss. You're still going to have more monsters spawning. However, your Beyond portals have 50% less merging radius, which means that you have to kill monsters in more tight packages in order to get Beyond packs spawning. This is going to be an XP multiplier, this is going to be a drop multiplier, but I don't think it's going to be a good enough one for people to want to use. I'm happy to be proven wrong on that. Okay, so after this we have two Ritual Keystones, and I just think these are both misses. So essentially the problem with Ritual at the moment is that whilst it does provide a largish amount of loot per map, it takes a very long time to run your Ritual encounters in maps, and ultimately you don't get a payoff that's commensurate with the time investment. Also with Ritual, the overwhelming majority of the loot that you get comes from the very, 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 very rare jackpot drops that you don't often see, but that do come up once in a blue moon. Arbitrary Tenants is not going to help with this in any way. It's just going to give you a little bit of access to additional favour on average, although not necessarily in an always positive way. It's an average of only 5% reduced cost of favours. Now this is sometimes going to give you some more options if you've got like 3 things that you could only buy one of, and that they're all at roughly the same price. With Arbitrary Tenants, you might be able to buy the 2 cheapest of them. So in that sense, it's an upside, but it's also going to come at a risk where you might have something that is a phenomenally good drop that you get, and that phenomenally good drop might be so expensive that you can't even afford to defer it. So it's a risky thing to take, and I just don't think it's very good. Immutable Dogma is even worse. Immutable Dogma is something that you spec into only when you have an extremely, extremely good reward locked in your Ritual, and you're willing to respec your Atlas in order to take this bad node for a little while. Otherwise, you cannot reroll favors at Ritual altars in your maps. This is a killing blow to Ritual mechanics because everything is about those very rare jackpots. And if you go from rerolling twice a map to never rerolling, then you are going to see a 66% less multiplier in the number of Mirrors of Calandra that you get, the number of Headhunters that you get, as well as the semi-jackpot drops like Divine Orbs and the like. Getting extra tribute doesn't make up for this because the extra tribute that you've got, you don't have the big payoffs to spend it on. You're just going to be getting more 1 chaos stacks, 2 chaos stacks, 2 fusing stacks, the marginal things that you might take, you might not take on any given Ritual. You're going to get more of these, but at the expense of the things that are massively more valuable and that are the only reason you would be doing Ritual in general. So broadly speaking, this is not the buff Ritual needed. A couple of things we already knew about: Unending Nightmare and Timeless Conflict. These are things that are designed in order to make it so that players who have a less powerful character can get their feet wet in the relevant content. So Unending Nightmare is for Delirium and Timeless Conflict is for Legion. And they will also have some additional use at deep end game as well. But the primary use case is to help out players who are newer to the game. Next we have Crop Rotation, which is actually quite an exciting one. This is going to change the way Harvest plays a lot. Now we don't have the numbers on this, and the numbers are really important. Harvesting crops in your maps has a chance to upgrade the tier of plants of different colours. What is this chance? That is the question that is so important. Ultimately, crop rotation is going to live or die based upon the number of crops that you can get onto a particular map. But the more of them that you can get, the better this is going to get. And especially it's going to make it so that you're going to want to do your entire gardens, which is something a lot of people don't do at the moment. They go into the harvest garden, they look for tier 3 yellow monsters. If they're not there, they just walk out. I'm keen to see how this plays out. I think it's something that could be quite interesting, but it's all going to come down to what this chance is. What is this chance to upgrade? If it's 3%, then this is dead on arrival. If it's 30%, then this is going to be the best thing ever. It's probably somewhere in between. There's a couple of interesting things that modify the way that your Kirac mods work. So Bold Undertakings causes Fortune Favors the Brave to double down. I don't like this. I don't think this is very strong. Overloaded Circuits, though, does something quite interesting. League map crafting options also choose 3 random notable Atlas passive skills associated with that league to treat as allocated, and also doubles the cost of those various Kirac mods. So I think that this has 2 main purposes, Overloaded Circuits. The first one is a try before you buy approach to league mechanics that you've never experienced before. Let's say that you've never really gone hard on Harbinger content and you want to see what a Harbinger focused Atlas feels like. Well, you can throw a Gilded Harbinger Scarab into the map device, you can allocate Overloaded Circuits, and you can run Harbinger on the map device. Then for 12 Chaos plus your Gilded Scarab, you're going to get access to pretty juiced up Harbinger content on that map. And that's going to give you a bit of a sense. Once you've done this 3 or 4 times, you can decide for yourself, yep, Harbinger's for me, I'm going to respec my Atlas, I'm going to actually commit to spending a whole bunch of Regret Orbs to do that, and then I'm going to respec my Atlas accordingly to Harbinger. Or alternately, you might decide, yep, this isn't for me, I've given it a shot. The other utility that this is going to have is for challenges. There are likely to be challenges that require you to do something related to various Kirac mods, and this is going to be a really powerful way to get those done without having to spend anywhere near as many Orbs of Unmaking that I had to spend to do those 321 challenges that were similar. And come to think of it, there is potentially one more use for this as well, and that is if you get a particularly rare Sextant mod and you want to put it to good use in solo self-found play. Now, Meticulous Appraiser does 2 things that run somewhat at cross purposes to each other. Firstly, let's talk about the upside. You're going to be getting increased item rarity on anything that drops in your maps. This is going to be significant, and what item rarity does is it biases items towards being unique items instead of whatever they'd otherwise be. So, the positive side of this is you're going to get more chance for each individual item that drops in your maps to be a unique item. However, the drawback is you're just going to get flat out less items. Increased item quantity is a stat that multiplies the amount of raw currency orbs that drop, multiplies the amount of maps that drop, at least when it's valid. It's not always valid for every particular item that can drop and every source of increased item quantity, but when it can increase maps, it will do so. And it also increases the amount of divination cards that you get. You're going to be sacrificing those boosts to map sustain, to divination cards, and to currency in exchange for getting increased item rarity instead, i.e. a biasing towards more unique items. When is this a good trade? The answer is, in Trade League, almost never. It's probably okay on day one, and there'll be some corner cases where it's worth it in extremely weird juice strategies, particularly involving the use of reliquary scarabs, but I think for most people in Trade League, you don't want to use this. In solo self-found though, getting a particular uncommon or rare unique can be a big boost to your character's power, and as a result, this might have some use there. It's an interesting node. I'm not sure the numbers quite get there because it is important to state that decreasing the amount of items that you drop while also increasing the probability for any individual item to be a unique item is not all upside. There are definitely points in that number pendulum where it actually goes against you. So I'm interested by this one, but it's not something that I'm sold on. Next, we have the one that probably most interests me, and this is the 7th gate. This grants all possible league map crafting options are available while 6 gateways are allocated. Now, one thing that's come up a bit is, does this include things like Monstrous Treasure? No, it does not. Monstrous Treasure is not an option because it's not a league map crafting option, it's just a map crafting option. Now, the key merit to this is going to be either running Beyond when it's not on the map device and you want to use it, especially in conjunction with the Beyond Keystone, or the one that actually excites me is using this with Heist. In a league where Heist is on the map device, Heist materials that drop in maps generally are very, very cheap. Deception contracts at the end of Crucible were only like 7 chaos each. However, in a league where that's not the case, deception contracts may well be 17, 18 chaos each, and this is going to give you a lot of them. So this is something that I am thinking could actually be quite good for forcing Heist onto the map device when it's not an option. This also allows you to take advantage of sextants that other players probably don't want because they amp up a mod that is not on the map device. I definitely believe the 7th gate is much better in Trade League than it is in solo self-found. It certainly has its uses in solo self-found, especially in conjunction with rare sextant mods, but I think this is mostly a Trade League thing where you can spot the niche that no one else is doing, and then you can jump right into it, taking advantage of the 7th gate, and the fact that it's so inconvenient to spec into it is actually going to be an upside for you because your competition are going to have that barrier of entry, and most of them are going to decide, you know what, no, I'm not going to do this. Okay, so the Forbidden Sanctum changes, let's just summarize this to say that the Forbidden Sanctum is going to be a little bit meaner than it used to be, but your characters are going to be stronger in there as well because of the various things that relate to primary defenses. The Forbidden Sanctum is definitely going to be a lucrative thing if you can get into it, and it is going to be much harder to do a 0-hit run because of this 100 unit limit that's now in play. So monsters in the Forbidden Sanctum are immune to damage if there's no player within 100 units of them. Currently, monsters are immobile and immune to damage if there's no player within 120 units of them. So to give a sense of what 100 units means, the leftmost side of the screen to the rightmost side of the screen on a 16:9 resolution is 170 units. So it's about 2/3 of the full width of a screen, and it's quite a bit off screen, but not massively off screen. Once you start closing in on a monster, they're going to wake up and they're going to act before you're able to retaliate to them. So you're basically going to be able to kill monsters that are on your current screen or a little bit beyond it. That's what 100 units looks like. But this is going to be significant for the most degenerate strategies. And this is probably going to kill some of the tornado shot shenanigans that were really dominant in Sanctum League. Atlas changes, there's a number of maps leaving the Atlas, a number of maps that are rejoining the Atlas. The ones that are leaving include a few reasonably good maps, but it's not like it's a cross-section of the best maps either. The maps that are coming back are probably slightly better than the maps that are being removed. We'll miss Jungle Valley, but we'll gain Mausoleum and Mesa to fill that sort of role of giving players agency over the way that they engage with their altars. And additionally, for early league start, Cage and Pen are back, bringing good spots to farm your first 6 link of the league, which should be from the Divination card, the Chains That Bind. We still don't know what tiers all of these maps are going to be though. There's a couple of changes to divination cards, and probably the most significant one here is that the Cosprey's Malestive card is now dropping from the channel map. Presumably that will be from the boss only, because in the Canyon map it is only from the map boss. Additionally, unique maps are no longer offered as a mission when re-rolling Kirac's missions with an Explorer's Scouting Report. I think this may actually be because of me. I mentioned while I was streaming that there was a really broken strategy that was possible with this, and I was actually going to tell GGG about it, and then I forgot about it. The broken strategy that this is aimed at addressing is that you complete everything on your Atlas except for Coward's Trial in Trade League, then you buy a whole bunch of Explorer's Scouting Reports, you keep running them. They won't always give you a unique map, but when they do, it will very often be Coward's Trial in this situation. The only other maps it can be are rarer maps like Cortex. And then once you do get it, you open up a party to 5 other players, you sell them portals, and then you start rolling your next Kirac mission with your next Explorer's Scouting Report to chase your next Coward's Trial, because you don't go into the map and you don't get completion for it. That was the broken strategy that I thought of, that I thought needed to be nerfed, and I'm glad that they've done that. It's never fun when one of the best strategies is completely degenerate, completely unfun, and also something that players who play the game naturally will permanently lock themselves out of doing. Vaal side areas are getting a huge overhaul, and there's not much in the way of details here. One thing that's interesting though is that Vaal temple maps are being tied to them. Instead of being something that drops from map type rewards from Heist, from Delirium, and from particularly Blight, they're going to instead drop from other content. This might mean Vaal Temple maps are rarer, which will then in turn mean that Elder Guardian maps are rarer, because Vaal Temple maps drop a lot of copies of the Divination card, the Price of Protection, which is something that gives you an Elder Guardian influence map. Interestingly, the Beastcraft that used to give a Vaal Temple map is getting buffed to instead give a Synthesis unique map instead, which even if you get unlucky is going to be a big improvement over a Vaal Temple, but if you get lucky and get a Cortex, it's a huge improvement over one. There's a number of other little changes to the Atlas passive tree. I encourage you to have a read of this, but this is going to be something that once we go through the actual Atlas itself, there'll be a lot to discuss there in terms of the overall changes. There's new Beyond support, but it doesn't seem like it's anything amazing. The thing that's possibly interesting is Shaping the Valleys and Shaping the Seas are getting removed, which is a nerf, and Shaping the World is being added. Shaping the World is going to grant 5% chance for the map boss to drop an additional connected map, and 10% chance for maps that are found to be 1 tier higher. This is going to be pretty significant, and I think it will end up being a net neutral change overall. There's also some Torment support and Vaal side area support here that looks like it's fairly good. The existing Vaal side area support on the passive tree is pretty mediocre. So there's a bunch of things here that are being added in, and additionally a bunch of things are getting moved around on the Atlas. Okay, so let's get to the League Changes section, which is where we have the complete and utter gutting of Legion 5 ways. Domains of Timeless Conflict are losing a huge bunch of extra XP, and basically I think this is going to say that now we're no longer going to have Domain of Timeless Conflict being the dominant way that players reach level 100 in PathOfExile. Instead, most players simply won't reach level 100. Additionally, this is going to mean that the list of high-level characters is going to be much more closely aligned with the strongest characters of that league, which is going to make it more easy to work out the details of the actual league meta. So whilst this is a nerf, it's also indirectly a bit of a buff, because it's going to increase clarity about what the best builds are. I don't know how that's going to balance out overall. Additionally, these changes make doing a 2 or 3-way Domain of Timeless Conflict a little bit more appealing than it's been in the past. 5 ways will be a lot worse, and 4 ways will be about the same as they used to be. I do also think that this is going to make Timeless Duels rarer than they used to be. Not staggeringly rare, but I do think that getting a middle range Timeless Duel is going to be quite a bit rarer than it used to be as a result of this. Tormented Spirits are getting a whole bunch of AI improvements and a whole bunch of changes to their life and durability that should make them much more interesting, much more effective as a mechanic, and honestly, I think that this is going to make them feel more in line with the effects that Sentinels had in patch 3.18. We won't necessarily have the explosive amount of loot that Sentinels gave you, but Tormented Spirits will actually be able to touch a whole bunch of monsters now in a way that they haven't been able to do for a while, and they're also going to be able to possess monsters, and potentially even possess the player if you take the Keystone for them. Next we have the Ascendancy balance section. This is really small. There is very little changed. Guardian has had some minor changes since it was first announced. Nothing that's really transformative to the Ascendancy. Chieftain has had some changes as well since it was first announced. Namahu has been buffed, but really it is still functionally the same thing. I'm a lot warmer on Chieftain than a lot of other people are. I think that the key thing with Chieftain is the ability to ignore nearby enemies' fire resistance under conditions. is actually a lot stronger than people are giving it credit for, because it is a lot more common in the current state of the game to encounter a monster with extraordinarily high fire resistance than it has ever been in the past. Monsters who you can't strip their fire resistance away, because if you put flammability on a monster that's got 265% fire resistance, you bring it down to 220%, that is still massively overcapped. You then hit it with Wave of Conviction, it's still massively overcapped after your exposure. You hit it with a second resist stripping curse, it's still massively overcapped. There's a lot of these monsters in the game now, and Rumiko is going to melt them like butter. At the same time, it is just not very good at dealing extra damage to Pinnacle bosses, but I don't think you're going to be using this on characters that are Pinnacle boss specialists. If you're making a Pinnacle boss specialist, you are probably making a Saboteur instead of a Chieftain. There's details of the Ascendant Guardian, which is now worse than it used to be for aura support characters, but probably still fine. And there's details on the Ascendant Chieftain, which is interesting in that it's got 10% increased strength, whereas the Ascendancy itself does not have that anymore. There's a slight tweak to the Occultist here with Frigid Wake. This is only the cold node. The Occultist has been one of the best Ascendancies in the game for a while, and that's not really changing here. There was a bug with Frigid Wake where it was incorrectly using a fixed duration freeze that couldn't be modified. Now it is going to be modified by other sources of increased freeze duration your character might have, but the mechanics of that specific automatic freeze are being changed a little bit. All in all, this is no change for Chaos Occultists and maybe a slight buff for Cold Occultists, but not really anything significant. Mostly this is a bug fix. Passive Skill Tree is getting a bunch of extra support for Ignite-based melee builds again, like we were talking about, and also some bleeding-related ones as well. Some of these nodes are mediocre, some of them are good. The key thing here, though, is the Vengeant Cascade change we've already mentioned, which is returning projectiles have 150% increased speed. This is still somewhat useful for some builds, but it is no longer amazing, and it probably won't get used very much because it's just providing utility now, and people will probably go for a damage node instead of a utility node in general. The Strength of Blood Timeless Duel node is something that is getting completely and utterly gutted because it was making too many builds immortal for ultra deep delving, and that's something that I'm surprised took as long as it did. That node has been mostly ignored by players, but it's been particularly broken in a few specific situations. Essentially, I feel like that has been completely and utterly gutted now. Now we have the big change in skill balance. This is the Poison Nerf that should have happened last league. Instead of all the nerfs that happened to Wither, it should have instead been this. Temporal Chains now has other effects on cursed enemies expire 25% slower at all gem levels, previously 40%. This should have happened last league instead of all the changes that happened to Wither, and the Wither changes now could probably be reverted. Those were aimed as a nerf to Poison, but they caught all of the chaos damage over time builds in the crossfires. As a result, builds like Bane and Soulrend were in a pretty bad place in 321. Well, this is going to make Bane even worse. And really, I think there's a real problem here where Bane and Soulrend's numbers are based around the availability that Wither had back in 3.20, but all those things related to Wither got nerfed because Poison needed a nerf in 3.20, and rather than nerfing the thing that was the problem, GGG went and nerfed a bunch of other things instead. So, not really happy that this change is happening without a reversion of those Wither things, although this change is something that definitely needed to happen. Otherwise, there's a lot of really small changes here. The Unseen Strike, triggered by the Hidden Blade unique dagger, is something that needs a little bit of a look into now. This had a cooldown of 0.5 seconds, and I think it's now being changed to be equal to your character's attack speed. This could be pretty good, and something that's worth a real look, but I need to research the Hidden Blade dagger before I can really say much further on that. Item balance wise, there's a few changes here that matter. So Delve exclusive shield prefix modifiers are no longer rolling, but these mods are still available as shield suffixes, so there's going to be an alternate source for these, but it's not exactly the same as what exists. There's definitely been a lot of hot trading for these things in both Standard and Crucible League, especially the fractured versions since this went live. The Vaal modifier for ailment duration while focused has been nerfed again, and it is still so good that it's going to feel mandatory to take on a lot of builds. So basically, this is one of those cases where something was ridiculously powerful and other things were being balanced around it. This was probably the problem, and it's especially something that was busted with Poison. This is getting a targeted nerf. This is the sort of thing that should have happened instead of all of those changes to Wither that happened last league. Flask modifiers that grant a percentage of life recovery to minions now grant much higher percentages because minion life scales a lot higher than player life does, especially in the endgame, so they're now going to range as high as 200%. And of course the Crucible mod that caused totems to explode on death has been giga nerfed. This is the biggest nerf I think I've ever seen. It is getting a 95% less multiplier to the amount of damage that it does. And of course, this change affects existing items because new ones can't be made. So basically, those totem explosion nodes from Crucible are completely and utterly squashed. But I've heard some people saying that they were so broken that they may actually still be alright even with this. After this, there's a whole section on Ruthless specific changes. Sort of discussed that at the start, that it's basically a bunch of database changes that GGG have made that probably took 1 or 2 people 1 day of work each, and that's basically their level of support for Ruthless at the moment. These are going to be changes that allow the Ascendancies to have 4 sets of passives instead of 3. There's a lot there. If you're interested in playing Ruthless, then definitely have a read of this. If you're not interested in playing Ruthless, then you can completely skip this section of these changes. Additionally, there's some skill balance changes in Ruthless only, which relate to Determination and Grace. They're no longer going to provide flat armor and flat evasion, and instead they're going to have slightly higher numbers. So basically, Determination and Grace are much worse than they were previously in Ruthless. There's also a number of Ruthless exclusive changes to the Atlas passive tree, and a couple of other little things, one of which is important, which is the chance to encounter extra league content in maps now scales with map tier. Now we get to things that affect Ruthful as well. Shaper Guardians, Elder Guardians, and Conquerors now drop far fewer influenced items on death. This is one of those interesting cases where, as a Trade League player, when I saw this, I'm like, hey, that's actually going to feel like an increase in loot. The reason for that is that Shaper Guardians, Elder Guardians, and Conquerors drop so many influenced items in 3.21 that they aren't loot and you just take them off your loot filter. Now, this might result in a situation where these actually feel like loot. So that's going to be an interesting change to see how that plays out. For solo self-found players though, this is a flat out nerf. Some of the tainted currency that drops from beyond monsters is being shifted to beyond bosses. But what's not clear from this is not something I thought of in the original live stream. When they say the outcome odds, this could actually be the biasing towards various currencies. For instance, we know the Tainted Divine Teardrop is an incredibly rare beyond currency. It may well be that the Tainted Divine Teardrop is actually biased towards now on beyond bosses a little bit more, but is even rarer from beyond trash. We don't know. That could be what this means, or alternately it could just mean a reduction in quantity, but with no change to the biasing between the different types of currency that you can get. One of the biggest things of all, monsters that are unable to be damaged or targeted no longer regenerate life, energy shield, or recharge energy shield. Every time that you run a map that is a Conqueror map, a Veritania map specifically, or a Elder Guardian map such as the Eradicator, when the boss has some sort of invulnerability phase, it is really tilting to have them replenish all their energy shield. It looks like that's not going to happen anymore. And the Belfry boss is being nerfed. Existing item filters are all going to be broken by this patch, which is important to know. And then there's a number of things that are listed as bug fixes. Some of these will have some balance consequences, but none of them are massively transformative in any way. They're just little things that might affect your build, but that aren't something that's going to have a sweeping effect upon the sort of whole league economy or the whole of the league meta. There's also a couple of little changes that have been made since the original post was made, but these are all pretty minor and they're mostly clarifications or corrections of obvious typos. Anyway, that is the 3.22 patch notes short version. If you want to watch the long version of it, and that's actually a lot longer than even this video. This video, while I've been recording it, I've been going for 47 minutes. I'll probably cut it down a bit in the actual final edit, but it is going to be a long video. The original live stream was something like 4 and a bit hours. I'm going to put a link to that down in the bottom left corner of your screen right now. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. May your Vaal orbs have interesting results, and I will see you around.